But a couple that I did want to try to get to, this idea of peer-reviewed studies in the medical and scientific literature, it's the gold standard, right? If we don't have a peer-reviewed study, we can't even – in fact, probably the opposite of what's printed on the paper is true, okay? Well, here's what I got for you. I've got a peer-reviewed study that just came out. And you know what this study says? This is very interesting. Comes out of Guangdong, China, and it's got the list of authors and contributors is too long to read. It'd probably take the whole rest of the segment just to read it. But these are big laboratories and departments of various universities that all contributed to this study, and a number of researchers, all of whom are named. And the article, the study title is, Are Pangolins the Intermediate Host of the 2019 Novel Coronavirus? ? And guess what the study concludes? The study concludes that no, pangolins are not the intermediate host. So what does that mean? People say, well, it didn't go directly from a bat to a human. This is in the sort of natural transmission model, which we're a little bit agnostic about and or disbelieving of. But the natural transmission model, the idea that it went from a bat to a human, well, it didn't go directly. So they say, well, it must have gone through some other intermediate host. And they say, well, if you look at that wet market, remember, people are eating pangolins. Now, what are pangolins? They're like a little anteater looking thing. People are eating pangolins. Can't be eating pangolins. You can't be eating bat soup. That stuff is gross, which I imagine it probably is actually gross. But in any event, let's be a little more culturally sensitive. It's not well matched to our existing taste buds. But we now have a peer-reviewed study that concludes that, in fact, pangolins are definitely not the intermediate host for the coronavirus. So just think about all of the news articles that you read that told you that's what happened. And you probably read them and thought, well, that sounds pretty true. It sounds reasonable to me. What do I know? I'm not a scientist, right? It sounds, well, okay. So it went through the pangolins at the wet market. Well, now here's a peer-reviewed study says that's not true. That's not true. Another study came out recently. And what I'm trying to do by sharing these studies with you is to illustrate the uncertainty of what we consider to be scientific knowledge. We think we know stuff, but it ought to always come with a caveat that says we think this is the truth, but there may be things that we learn in the future that tell us that this isn't the truth. But that's not the way they deliver it, right? They tell you things like, if we don't lock down the country, there will be 2.2 million deaths in the country. Remember that? If we don't, well, that was based on a model. Well, now we've learned that model was flawed. The assumptions that went into the model, even the numbers that went into the model, it wasn't accurate. That didn't happen anywhere in the world. That didn't happen in Sweden. They didn't have that kind of death rate in Sweden where they didn't go into lockdown. And we now know those models were flawed and they were revised. But when they were given out to the public, they weren't given out as, hey, by the way, we don't know this. This is just a thought we're having right now. This is a possibility. Could be flawed, could be wrong. Our assumptions may not be accurate. These numbers may be wildly inflated. That's not how they put it to us, right? They told us, no, this is what will happen. You have to understand, folks, you're not a scientist. You can't possibly understand. Just trust the scientists, and the scientists tell us the following. Well, here's another study that came out, and I want to be clear, this one isn't peer-reviewed, so take all your pot shots at this study. Speaking of pot shots, we got to talk a little bit, if we can, about that L.A. fire. Okay, but take all your pot shots at this study out of Flinders University in Australia, and this study determined that the coronavirus did not likely come from an animal source, that it is optimized for penetration into human cells via the ACE2 receptors that many of us have heard about. But this particular virus is optimized for penetration into human cells, not animal cells. So it probably didn't come out of animals if it's optimized to human. And the study concludes that this implies that the virus may have been created in a lab. Now, there's no conclusion that it definitely was created in a lab, but it says this would be a remarkable coincidence or a sign of human intervention at some level. That doesn't mean it was created from scratch in a lab. That may have means it was picked up by the lab and then run through some different, intermediate animals and somehow modified genetically through the many processes that they have for doing that in the lab. And it was modified to, more optimally bind to the human ACE2 receptor than to the animal ACE2 receptor. Now, again, that's not a final conclusion. That's just another thought. But you've got to keep these things in mind, and you've got to understand how little we actually know about this at this time, how little we can really hang our hat on in the case of this coronavirus. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.